One thing that I think really doesn't get talked about very often is leveling, and how leveling is actually the bridge between GTO and exploitative poker. Today I'm going to explain what the heck that means. Let's get into it. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today I want to talk about leveling, GTO, exploitative poker, and a whole bunch of other things. But let's start by getting definitions out of the way and understanding what the heck leveling actually means. So this is from my first book, Dynamic Four-Ring Poker, and here's how I defined the basic levels of leveling. Level 0, I am not thinking. Level 1, what do I have, aka what are my cards? Level 2, what does my opponent have, aka what do I think my opponent's cards are or range? Level 3, what does my opponent think that I have? Level 4, what does my opponent think that I think that they have? Level 5, what does my opponent think that I think that they think that I have? And so on and so on. So for what it's worth, we always want to be one level ahead of our opponents. So most of our opponents that we play against in smaller games are going to be level 1 opponents, just thinking about what cards they have and how those cards interact with the board and the strength of their overall hand right this moment. So if we're just a level 2 thinking about what they have, we can develop a really nice edge. You always want to be an odd number of steps ahead, never an even number of steps for what it's worth. So with that in mind, let's see how that can relate using an example from my new book, GTO Gems. Alright, so for this we're going to use a modified version of the perfect polarization model, and the model is this. We are playing a river situation, $100 in the middle, everyone has a $100 stack, the aggressor is out of position first act, the defender is in position, the aggressor has a polarized range, value hands and bluffs only, their value hands will always win at showdown and their bluffs will always lose at showdown, and the defender has a range of pure bluff catchers, but this is where the modification comes in because they're going to have bluff catchers plus a couple of busted draws as well. Their bluff catchers are always going to beat the aggressor's bluffs, and the bluff catchers are always going to lose to the aggressor's value hands. So very simple model. So as we're going through this conversation, keep in mind that we're going to consider the out of position player the aggressor and the in position player the defender, even though of course the defender can bet if the aggressor checks. And this is largely where the conversation is jumping off of, is thinking about should the aggressor mix some of their strong hands as checks on the river, or should they just fire all their strong hands as well as some bluffs. So this is built on the back of that whole conversation. So in the original perfect polarization model, Dissolver suggested that the aggressor should be value betting 100% of the time on the river. They should not be mixing in any checks with that overall strategy on the river. However, that's a very simplified example and really lacks some of the nuance of real life situations. So adding in these busted gut shots for the defender can start to mimic something that looks a little bit more real. And from this, we can start to understand how these GTO strategies are actually formed. Alright, so let's start following the leveling steps as we go through, bridging from the simplified perfect polarization model, where again the aggressor is always betting their value hands and thus doesn't have them in their checking range, versus the more modified example where the defender has more busted gut shots in their range. So level 1 or step 1 here is that the defender begins to realize the aggressor is always folding after checking the river, right? Because if the aggressor is always betting all of those strong hands, then inherently none of those strong hands are in the aggressor's checking range. The defender then exploits the aggressor by always bluffing the river with busted draws and checking behind with their bluff catchers. So that's a pretty simple adjustment by the defender in this situation. Step 2 is that the aggressor begins to realize that the defender is bluffing a huge amount when checked to on the river. The aggressor calculates that they can now generate a higher expected value by checking value hands on the river and inducing a bluff. Step 3, the defender suspects that the aggressor is simply not folding anymore after checking, so the defender starts reducing their overall bluffs. Step 4, the aggressor realizes that the defender is not bluffing as often when checked to, and that checking value hands no longer maximizes EV. The aggressor shifts most value hands back into the betting range. However, since the defender has shown that they are capable of exploiting an undefended checking range, the aggressor continues to check a percentage of value hands. It will no longer be plus EV to try to push the exploit too far, since there will be a breaking point where the defender realizes that they're being exploited and lowers the EV of the aggressor by countering. Step 5. The defender does in fact realize that the aggressor is once again folding too much after checking, although not folding quite as often as before. The defender starts to bluff the river when checked to, but not quite as aggressively as before. The defender knows that the aggressor is capable of countering if the bluff to value ratio gets too far out of line, so the defender does their best to subtly exploit the aggressor without making it too obvious. Step 6. The aggressor is smart enough to notice that the defender is bluffing slightly more often than correct when check 2 on the river. The aggressor then subtly shifts a few more value hands into their checking range. Perhaps the defender will not notice and will continue to overbluff when check 2. Step 7. The defender picks up on the fact that the aggressor is not folding quite often enough for bluffing to be profitable. The defender subtly starts bluffing less often than is correct, but does not push things as far as they did previously. Step 8. The aggressor notices the small adjustment in the defender's bluff to value ratio and shifts a minuscule amount of value combos back into the betting range where their EV will be highest. In step 9, the defender realizes that the aggressor is now overfolding the river by a minuscule amount after checking. Notice how the two players iterate against each other, using smaller and smaller exploitative responses at each step. We might visualize this as displayed in the following diagram. You'll notice that each sequential action gets closer and closer to that center, that red ball in the middle, and that's the really key important point, because that red center dot is the point where there are no additional exploitative opportunities available for either player. Each player is completely balanced and cannot increase their win rate by deviating from their current strategy. In game theory lingo, this is referred to as the Nash equilibrium. Simply put, the Nash equilibrium is a term that describes the game state where no player can increase their win rate by deviating. In poker terms, a Nash equilibrium is achieved when two players are playing perfect GTO poker against each other. So the big macro takeaway from this whole conversation and all these different steps in this conversation is not to get bogged into the minutia of a singular step, rather to understand that if the aggressor were to put all of their value hands into their betting range and have none in their checking range, they would become very, very exploitable to someone who's paying any level of attention, which can then inherently allow counter strategies for their opponent and really make their life a living hell, and also just in general less profitable, lower the overall EV of the aggressor's overall strategy. Unless, and it's an important unless, the defender in this situation is a non-adjusting player, and they're not capable of finding exploitative counter strategies. So as a simple example, let's just say that the defender in this situation was actually not capable of firing that bluff if you check to them as the aggressor. So if that's the case, you don't have to worry about checking your value combinations because they're not going to put you in any sort of pressure or hell. They're not going to over adjust. They're not going to start firing every single time you check that river. They're simply going to check behind when they have single pairs. They're always going to check behind their air because they're just fearful of firing out a bluff, whatever it is. And as such, it would make zero sense for you to check your value combinations against that person, right? You would fire 100% of your value combos and you would just simply check whatever leftover bluffs don't make sense for you to bluff with in this situation. This is the way you can start thinking about these kind of situations instead of just saying, oh, well, I have to adhere to Solverland. Solverland is great, but it's a starting point. The exploitative edges are where things get really, really interesting and where your EV potential can get much, much higher. So I hope that gives you some additional context on what leveling is, how it kind of relates to GTO and exploitative play. And again, the big takeaway is thinking about whether you need to adhere to something that's more GTO oriented. So playing against much better players, you're trying to make sure that you're not exploiting too hard in the sense that you're allowing your opponent to then have easy counter exploits against you. This is kind of the big takeaway. Most of the time when you're playing in smaller games, it's simply going to be exploit city, tons and tons of opportunities to exploit if you pay attention and do a little bit of strategic study off table. But when you're playing against better opponents, being more aware of what the GTO orientation is and trying to adhere closer to it is a much smarter decision. And if you're interested in learning more about GTO and you want to go even further with your study, I highly suggest picking up GTO Gems and giving it a read. It's a pretty darn quick book and it goes through the macro principles of GTO play that you can use regardless of what level you're currently playing and what your goals are in poker. This is going to be huge to understand some of these big underlying GTO principles that apply simply everywhere. You can pick up your copy today by going to redchippoker.com/gems or look for GTO Gems on Amazon if you're looking for the paperback or Kindle version. Regardless of which version you pick up, I hope you enjoy it and I can't wait to hear what you think about it. Again, redchippoker.com/gems to get started today. And that's going to wrap it up for this one. Thank you so much for hanging out today. If you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video. And in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.